Jack,
John,
we're going to talk today about exercise.
great topic.
It's obviously an area that we're super interested in. For those who follow us, they know that we post a lot of different content around exercise prescription, performance training, and what that means for the rehabilitative process. And we thought we might start by going through the lens of the paper that you presented this past week. For those who are interested, it is on our Instagram. Do you want to give us a bit of an idea of what that paper was about?
Yeah. So it's quite an interesting paper that was published a few years ago by Blasgrove and a couple of other authors. And it's a systematic review of looking at strength training in middle distance runners. Probably a useful article to talk about too, because it allows us to explore what specificity means, because specificity isn't always about the actual mechanics of the movement, but also specificity in terms of the adaptations, tissue adaptations that you may elicit. So in short, what they found was that there was an improvement in running performance in middle and long distance runners. So the big ones that were clear was improvements in running economy, so essentially the energy efficiency in which they complete their event. Time trial performance, which is obviously relevant because
you're getting faster.
It's about the hardest measure you can get in terms of its relevance. And also the other one was related to maximal sprint speed, which a lot of people may not think is that relevant to middle and long distance runners.
People in running would understand this because Absolutely. It fits into this idea of speed reserve. So as an example for people in the distance community, if your target marathon pace is 4 minute kilometers, if your fastest 1K that you can do is 3 minutes 50, you're in a lot of trouble when it comes to running at 4 minute kilometers. But if your fastest 1 kilometer is 250, for instance, take a whole minute off that, 4 minutes feels like absolutely cruising.
Yes.
And obviously that's extended over a marathon, so that's that speed reserve, but that goes all the way down to even shorter events. So, those who know a little bit more about my track coaching background will know I coach, say, 400 meter runners. One of the things in 400 meters we always talk about is the athlete actually being fast enough to be able to go through the segments and still feel relatively relaxed. And that's that whole idea of speed reserve. And so the maximal sprint speed for a distance runner is extremely important. Even though on a surface level, it may appear like it's not particularly relevant.
Well, it's extremely relevant for middle distance runners because, how many runs finish in
the sprint finish? Yeah.
Or not to mention in terms of tactics, particularly middle distance, seeing variations in speed. And maybe
to give that an example of that, we're fortunate enough, and we're hoping that at some stage we'll get him on the podcast to spend some time with Justin Rinaldi, who's probably Australia's most eminent 800 meter coach at the moment. And I asked him not that long ago, what are the top athletes doing in the last 200 meters? And they're still running 26 seconds or so for the last 200, 26, somewhere in that range. And so that means that your last 100 meters is going to be in that 13-second range. If you can only run 12 seconds, it's not going to happen in the 600 to 800 of your race. But if you can run 11 seconds and you've got a 2-second buffer, then there's very clear potential to do so.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about this study is these benefits are seen from moderately trained to essentially elite athletes. So I think particularly when you're getting more towards that elite athlete where, yes, of course, a big component of their training program is going to be doing lots of aerobic conditioning. But there's that issue of window of diminishing returns, because for an elite athlete, this is something that's discussed in the paper. If we look at something like VO2 max, we know that that's a good measure of comparing elite versus non-elite runners. If you actually look at the elite running population group, the variation in VO2 max is not correlated with who wins the race versus who gets last in the race.
And so even when we discussed this as our clinical group, a few of our physios sort of said, well, but what do you mean by that? So can you elaborate on why you might not necessarily see that correlation between VO2 max and the outcome within the elite population itself?
Oh, because there's multiple factors at play. And this is where the findings of the study are really relevant, because one of the things that actually is a good indicator of seeing the variation in performance in the elite group is some anaerobic measures. And
that's in middle distance running we're talking. So
that's
this is 800, 1500 meter type athletes.
Yes, I think it was even up to like 5,000.
Yeah, 5,000 is generally still considered middle distance.
There you go. But it highlights something that's really important in thinking of, well, like what's actually going on here? Why are you seeing improvements from doing resistance training in middle and distance runners when you start to think that specificity, it's moving away from it? And this relates to two particular things. One, looking at the improvements of rate of force development, which we see as having some correlation to things like running economy, so running efficiency.
Yeah, and that's how much oxygen you're actually utilizing to create, the output that you're getting from that aerobic metabolism. So if your running economy is better, you'll be using less oxygen to run at the same speed.
Yes. And it's interesting to look at this further, thinking, well, how does rate of force development related to distance running? And part of this has to think about, when you're thinking of a distance runner, their ground contact times are still relatively short. You probably got a better idea than I do.
About 0.15 to 0.18.
Yeah, okay. So they've got a relatively small window in terms of producing force. So the more efficient they can be at producing that force in a short period of time, the more recovery that they have within the rest of the running cycle. And so part of that goes to thinking about utilizing aerobic versus anaerobic energy systems too, because as you particularly improve your running economy, you're going to maintain more of your aerobic energy reserve essentially. And so you don't have to tap so much into that anaerobic energy system. And the other big one too relates to thinking of the structural changes or biomechanical changes to tendon. So when you think about distance running, so much of it is based on running efficiency. The more you can utilize your connective tissue system to produce force, the less metabolically demanding the task is, because connective tissue has the ability to use elastic energy potential, which is much less metabolically demanding than contracting the muscle. And so as you improve the stiffness of the tendon, it can act more like a spring. So you get as you make that ground contact, you're going to get the spring loading up. The muscle will just be contracting to regulate how that spring's loaded. And then you get the release of that elastic energy potential that help propel you forward.
Yeah. And we know, there's been lots of evidence showing plyometric or jump type training can really have an effect on your ability to use those elastic forces. And in this area, specifically for people interested in distance running, physiologist and track coach Philo Saunders did research in the early to mid 2000s showing significant improvements in running economy for distance and middle distance runners using a plyometric scheme. Within those populations. So it's been shown consistently that when you improve those elastic features of connective tissue structures particularly in the lower limb, that running economy improves. And
this systematic review included doing everywhere from, say, heavy resistance training to more the explosive plyometric training.
Jump stuff. Yep.
And essentially, you want to utilize a combination of both, and that's what's going to be based on their training history and so on, which we'll probably talk more about. I think the other thing to highlight too is, as you can better utilize your connective tissue system through the stretch shortening cycle, you're not going to get as much changes in the fascicle length of the muscle. So it's going to act and contract much more isometrically. In that situation where you're not getting big rapid changes of the fascicle length, and i.e. shortening velocity, it's going to be much less metabolically taxing on the muscle itself. So I think this is it's obviously a valuable study to understand that if you work with distance runners, but I think it also highlights the topic of discussion today, thinking of when you prescribe exercise, why are you prescribing it?
Yeah. And because on the surface, like you're saying, when someone says, I've prescribed resistance training for a distance runner, the first question often invariably is, particularly from the distance runners, why would I do that?
Mm-hmm.
Why wouldn't I just do more running training?
Yeah. And this goes back to one of the comments I made before of thinking of two things. One, window of diminishing return, because in elite athletes, their aerobic capacity is fantastic. And that's due to years of chronic training, which is something that's obviously going to be the basis for distance running performance.
There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. And there's no suggestion to say that you can just utilize resistance training. This is thinking about, okay, well, how do I apply different types of stresses to the system to induce neurophysiological changes that I haven't otherwise done with the training program so far? And this is probably a good point to start of thinking about this very important and hopefully obvious concept of adaptation. Because one thing I think that's, again, hopefully obvious but important to highlight is humans are biological systems. So what does that actually mean? It means that based on the fact that we are biological, we are constantly changing and adapting to stresses that we apply to the system.
I think this concept is something that often gets lost when people use terminology and they use analogies that suggest that the human system is mechanical.
Yes.
And the big differentiation for me is that the outcomes, or the possible outcomes from the implementation of some sort of stimulus on a biological system means that there's three possible outcomes. You can have a negative response in which the capacity of that system is reduced. You can have a neutral response where it's neither reduced or improved. Or you can have a third response, which is not possible in a mechanical system, which is that system actually adapts and improves from that application of stress. The dumb example that I always give is, doesn't matter how fast you drive your car, driving it fast will never make the top speed go up, right? Whereas if you run faster, your body will learn, particularly, and we'll talk about changes with aging, but particularly as a younger athlete, for instance, if you run faster, your body will adapt over time and your maximum speed will go up. That doesn't happen with a mechanical system. It doesn't happen with a car. You won't all of a sudden have a higher top speed in your car because you drive it near its maximum.
Yes, it's not this idea that at a certain age, let's say the development of physical maturation at 20, 25, whatever it may be, that it's simply just downhill from there. I think what's also important to highlight is the timeline for adaptation is also not linear. And we can look at that at a micro or macro level. And this brings us to a really important concept that we often talk about of hormesis.
And I think most people, hormesis itself was originally brought forward by people using in toxicology, actually seeing the response to different toxins, and the fact that if you slowly expose yourself to different toxins, you actually developed an immunity at a certain level, as long as the magnitude or the volume of that toxin was not done in the stimulus was not too high at one point. And it's an important concept that we'll get to. Completely.
And it relates to that Goldilocks principle. Yep. Because again, too much of a particular, if we think of toxin as a stressor, and when we think, you'll often hear us talk about physical activity, mechanical stress as a stressor, because that's essentially what it is. Yeah. And it's that point of finding what is the appropriate magnitude of stress for that individual. So there's obviously too much and we get maladaptation, too little, no adaptation, but finding that sweet spot is really important.
And I think intuitively, and this is why I think we want to talk about this, intuitively people understand this. Anyone who's done any level of exposure to sport or training knows that if you've done no training leading into a preseason, if you jump straight into preseason, you're probably going to be very sore, and or if you go too hard too quickly, you'll probably get injured. So even at a very basic level, I think you ask teenagers and they're very aware of that if they've participated in sport or exercise. What I think is the more important discussion then is, okay, well, if we know that intuitively, how do we use that knowledge then to start developing our understanding of exercise prescription? if we know that there are these three responses, if we know that there is this process of adaptation that we're starting to introduce, how do we then manipulate our prescription to match that, to create opportunities for maximizing, hopefully, what we want is positive adaptation, improvement in the capability of that person, whether it's to run faster, jump higher, lift heavier, resistances, or, be able to run for longer if it's, say, a distance athlete.
What principles have you adopted?
In what respect?
Based on your comment, like what are the things that you see as the foundation for things that you consider when thinking about prescribing exercise in a rehab or high performance setting?
Well, the big areas that I think we've spoken about a lot are understanding the individual and what their current capability is in terms of tolerating stress. Because we all understand that, and most people who work in this field would understand the idea of training history. And the reason, I question this, if people ask questions, but they haven't really thought about why do we even ask that question. And the main reason that you're asking a history around their training or exposure to, say, sport or physical activity is because you want to know, do they have the ability to tolerate very high exposure to that sport?
And that's essentially what training is.
It's exposure to stress.
Correct. It's about preparing the system to be able to meet the requirements of that particular sport or task. And I think also, because even here we also work in athlete populations, but also general populations, we also need to think on the other end of the spectrum is there the issue of potentially, actually it relates to both, the issue of underuse.
Yeah, well, as I said, if you take the opportunity to understand someone's ability to tolerate stress in whatever area, right, particularly if it's related to physical activity, you then start to get an appreciation of where you can pitch the intervention. You also then have an idea of what pieces of the puzzle do you actually need to implement. Because we've spoken before, and it's probably come up in a number of discussions we've had about identifying where the deficits are. And we spoke about at the start of this about distance running. And if you have a distance runner who has had very little training, but they want to get better at distance running, as you said, you're going to get most bang for your buck out of doing more running. But once they've reached an elite level, it's diminishing returns. You cannot keep doing a volume of training forever because that stress stimulus would potentially be so high that you're then risking breaking down the tissue or creating an injury because of your exposure to the stress. So what do you start working on? And initially, if someone has had no exposure or very little exposure, you're going to work on the things that are the most relevant. And that brings forward discussion of, okay, what does create the most adaptation? And everyone listening who's got some background in, exercise prescription or sports performance would understand and have heard the SAID principle, specific adaptation to impose demand. And that in itself, although it seems very implicitly clear, I don't know that people necessarily use that when they design programming, because what they do is they seem to do a lot of what I would consider fluff before implementing something that's actually going to create adaptive change. And there may be reason for that, which we'll get into about people having low stress tolerance. So your job is to increase their stress tolerance capabilities before you maybe impose higher levels of stress. But that principle in itself gives you an idea of what's going to create the greatest transfer. And I get asked this question a lot of, how do you design your programs? How do you design the actual structure of your training sessions or your training weeks? And it's all about understanding what is the most important factor that's going to make the biggest change for what that person needs.
At that point in time. Based on their training history. And I think part of that comes to a concept we'll often talk about of maturation. Because, I know we've talked about this a lot and probably be useful to explore it, say, with looking at some of the track athletes you work at. Their training age is going to give you indications about, one, the magnitude of stresses that they can tolerate, and two, the actual response to the stressor.
All right, so let's wind it back. What give a basic definition for people of magnitude?
Okay, well, magnitude the main factors that will influence magnitude is the intensity of the stimulus.
So if that was running, it would be, say, the speed that you're running at?
Correct. And I think the two main variables we think about when we think about mechanical stressor and intensity is the force characteristics and the velocity characteristics. And so, I mean, a good example to think of is for the untrained athlete, or for someone maybe even in the general population, or someone following an injury, their stress tolerance is going to be a lot lower. So the magnitude of the force or velocity that they can tolerate or positively adapt to is going to be much more at the lower.
And I think we understand this inherently. If you ask someone about, say, resistance training, and you said, all right, every day you're going to go and do a 1 RM, you would realize pretty quickly that that's a recipe for disaster at a certain point.
Yes.
Because the mechanical tension that you're creating day in, day out is not able to be withstood by that individual because they haven't done a lot of resistance training.
Yes.
Right? So their tissue probably isn't going to tolerate it. And if we divert very briefly, I won't go on too much, but if we look at a mechanical model, and as we've said, the human body is not a mechanical model, but to give us some understanding using an analogy, if we want to say, if you look at stress life curves, which are used in materials engineering, basically what they do is they take maybe, say, a piece of steel, and they'll apply a mechanical tension to where they're bending it, and they'll see how much force can they put through that piece of steel and how many times does it take before it breaks at that level of force. And they'll do it at a range of different levels of force application to that piece of steel. It's a silly example, but I'm sure it's been done before. And what they find is the curve shows that if the magnitude's really high, it needs very few cycles of stress. And if the magnitude's low, it can tolerate much more cycles of stress, right, before it breaks. And we can apply this in a very simple sense to the human body. It's not, as we said, it's not a perfect analogy because the human body does have adaptive abilities, and it's much more complex than a basic mechanical model.
And it's actually not linear too. Because if you look at the
stress life curve is not linear either.
Yeah, okay. But I was thinking, you see that too with, like, say, the stress-strain relationship, where it actually is exponential.
Yeah.
And it's based on not just the magnitude of force, but also the rate of loading too.
And we understand this, right? I gave this example in a blog that I did. I don't remember exactly which one, so apologies for those listening, but you will be able to find it in one of the blogs that I wrote, where everyone understands magnitude in the sense of failure for a tissue or a whole system. When you say, okay, if I ask you to jump off a 20-story building, you know that's going to be catastrophic failure, right? And say 20 stories, I don't even know how tall that is, but say that's 100 meters, right? But if I ask you to jump off half a meter 200 times, you could probably do it without your tissue failing, even though the cumulative height that you've fallen from is 100 meters.
Yeah.
So the magnitude of that is way too high for what your tissue can tolerate. And the same thing happens with training. If I said to you, all right, Jack, load up the bar over there and you're going to try and do a 200 kilo bench press, you probably would hurt yourself if we unloaded the bar.
I think that's unfair.
You'd probably hurt yourself, right? But if I said to you, I want you to lift 50 kilos 4 times, you could probably do it very easily. So it gives us the idea that the repeated cycles are tolerated better than the actual magnitude. And we have to think about this in terms of stress tolerance, because this is exactly what we're trying to develop in an individual when they have no stress tolerance. That's why, for instance, if you look at programming and you look at periodization models, and for those people who haven't heard the term periodization, it's basically organizing how you apply stresses or training stimulus or rehabilitation sessions or stimuli or exercises. Typically, people will start with a stimulus that requires more volume but is at a lower intensity. And it's for this very reason. They know that implicitly that individual cannot tolerate the same level of mechanical stress and or metabolic stress.
Yes.
Now, that takes us onto the topic of developing metabolic, capacity to deal with stresses.
Yes. And part of that is understanding the cellular response to a stress, because whenever we apply a stress to our body, whether it's mechanical loading to induce, say, hypertrophy, whether it's like fasting to induce changes in our metabolic capacity, or things like inducing ketogenic or ketogenesis, more like cold heat therapy, we're also going to regulate the immune system. So, basic example, you go to the gym, you're a complete novice to doing resistance training, you apply mechanical stress. You're also creating...
Actually, this just made me think, when we say mechanical stress, I think a lot of people would know what we're talking about. But what's happening actually at a cellular level with that? Because I think people get, in many respects, stuck when they start thinking about why do we see certain changes within a tissue.
Yeah.
It becomes very obvious when you understand what's happening at a cellular level. So do you want to explain to people what happens at a cellular level when you apply mechanical stress?
Yeah. So this can be explained through the term mechanotransduction.
Yeah.
So when we apply a mechanical stress to our tissue, it creates electrical and chemical signals that essentially are messages to the cell within that corresponding tissue to upregulate certain genes and create synthesis of new tissue, protein synthesis.
Yeah. And so, and when we say mechanical stress, we mean, like, say you're doing bicep curls, that's creating stretch and compression and different mechanical shear forces on the actual cell.
Yes.
For those who understand, the cell biology, the cytoskeleton is being manipulated mechanically. It's like actually being stretched or squashed or pulled or, as you said, shearing.
Correct.
And that itself creates a stimulus to the internal structure of that cell to upregulate activity.
And there's a lot going on there because, again, let's stick with doing resistance training. Yes, the chemical and electrical signals will cause protein synthesis and, say, increases in cross-sectional area by laying down more muscle fibers, typically in parallel. Depends on
the application.
Yeah, let's not go down that right now. But we're also going to see changes to the connective tissue structure because the tensile forces means you're going to see changes in the tendon. You're going to see changes within the deep muscular fascia when we think about the endo-periepimysium. We're even going to see changes between the ability for the fibers and the fascicles to transmit forces laterally.
Yeah.
And the actual adaptations you get comes down to the principle that John highlighted before, specific adaptations to impose demands. And that's why we see variations in the neurophysiological adaptations based on these specific variables. So like the basic examples would be the magnitude of force, the length of the tissue, the rate of force application, the list goes on. But going back to thinking about what happens, so we get that mechanotransduction force, but we also get an inflammatory response, and we also create a little bit of oxidative stress. Now, these are actually important things. You need to have an inflammatory response. The release of cytokines and other chemical factors provide the signals that allow satellite cells to be activated, to be able to migrate to where they need to go to be able to proliferate, to be able to differentiate into myoblasts and then eventually into myotubes. So we need that inflammatory response and we need that oxidative stress to occur. They are necessary signals. That's why it's not a good idea to take things like non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, or there's quite interesting research of looking at, say, taking antioxidants like vitamin C and suppressing adaptations.
Or even cold therapy, the idea of, this has become a really interesting topic of, say you're in a very heavy training block and you're trying to really drive your improvement in a certain thing and you want adaptation. If you jump into a cold tub after every session, you're mitigating that. You're blunting that inflammatory response, which is that metabolic stimulus for tissue change and for potentially system change as well.
And that's why, kind of similar to the idea of that Goldilocks principle, you need the right amount of information. You can have too much, and that's because of a lot of factors related to health and well-being. So one of the issues that we have nowadays is due to people's low muscle mass, because muscle does secrete anti-inflammatory markers. Too much fat mass, which again is metabolically active and secretes pro-inflammatory markers. Being too sedentary, nutritional deficiencies, lack of sleep, all these different factors will influence and regulate the inflammatory response. And this is where, going back to what we were talking about before with the untrained athlete, the reason why you don't want to apply large magnitudes of force is you actually want to build up metabolic capacity. So what I mean by that is if you're in the gym doing, say, moderate weight and you're doing more high repetition, typically people think of, say, like 12, 15, 20 reps. But when I say that too, I mean you're getting to that repetition range and you're close to muscular failure. That is, you can't do any more repetitions. The stressor, although it will create some level of hypertrophy, we actually see more hypertrophy occurring within the sarcoplasmic reticulum.
Yeah, which is part of the structure that's helping deal with those metabolic features.
Correct, and also provides the machinery for contraction to occur. So these are things like the sarcolemma and the storages for where calcium, thinking about muscle physiology, secretion of calcium allows the actin changes.
Contraction, yeah.
I can't actually remember the specifics, with the troponin structure and moving away the connecting segment, so you allow cross bridges to form.
Yeah, and then break, and then the calcium reuptake and all of that kind of stuff.
And this is where it's very important to think about from a programming standpoint of having a certain level of metabolic capacity to deal with the inflammatory response, to deal with the oxidative stress, to provide the machinery necessary to allow repeated contractions if that's what's needed.
So we're speaking at the moment about the underlying basic, physiology of it and the basic sciences that we talk about a lot. But what does this now mean for structuring a program? If you get someone or, a rehabilitation plan or whatever it may be, or a training plan, what does that mean for someone who comes in and you get them in and you think, okay, they don't have a lot of exposure to this stressor.
Yeah.
What does that mean for how you would start to actually apply these principles?
So part of that is thinking of what is their ability to adapt and what is the magnitude of stress that you need to apply in order for that adaptation to occur.
Right. And on a basic level, if we ask those questions, someone is relatively young, they have not very much exposure. Would the intensity of the stimulus you apply be high or low or moderate?
Well, most likely, if they have no training history, it's going to be low. And part of that is obviously they need to build up skill acquisition. They need to build up the movement literacy required for that. Then you start to potentially increase the intensity so we can start to create or get them closer to that point of muscular failure, because we know that the closer you are to muscular failure, the more adaptation we see, at least from a hypertrophy standpoint. And that obviously fits in with this concept of hormesis because, well, the reality is in order to create change in the system, you need to go to a level of discomfort. Now, part of that is the trial and error and setting up safe to fail experiments of what is the required amount of stimulus for that person. I think something actually that's worth highlighting here too that relates to hormesis is thinking about the primary versus secondary response.
Yeah, and I think this is really important because I think as clinicians, we make this error a lot.
Yes.
Where we may have a negative primary response,
Correct.
Which is the person's really sore or it exacerbates potentially, say, the injured side or something like that.
Or just fatigue too.
Yeah. And we then pull away from the stimulus because we think that primary response is the ongoing outcome that we will receive from that stimulus.
And understanding that, because what I do clinically, I try to keep it very simple, is in terms of understanding what's the appropriate response, part of that is seeing what is their primary response to the stimulus. So for example, if someone comes back and they say, I feel completely fine, I don't have any indications of fatigue, muscle soreness, maybe
exacerbation of symptoms.
That gives me some really valuable information. I haven't applied enough stress to create an adaptation to the system.
Yeah, it's not enough stress to either have a good or bad outcome.
Yes.
And we spoke about this in the discussion that we had with Richard Newsham West, where we spoke about the idea of you want to see something happen.
Absolutely.
Even if it's negative, because that gives you more information than a neutral response.
Yes.
And typically, I think as clinicians, we get a little bit scared of the application of a stimulus that creates a negative response.
Yes.
We're always very happy when it's a positive response. Pain went down or they've got more function than they had previously. But the negative response, I think, is actually sometimes more valuable for how you then restructure what you're doing or make slight adjustments.
And obviously context is everything. Like if someone's coming back from a stress fracture and they come back and go, I've got a lot of localized pain at my stress fracture site.
You've applied too much stimulus.
Of course, like context is everything. And this is about using your clinical reasoning. At the same time too, I think we need to be a bit more critical about if we're applying a stressor that's very low, you may see the primary response be a positive one. So an example may be doing, like, say, gentle manual therapy. Now, again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. So it can be very useful to create a window where they feel an improvement in their function, and then you may apply a stressor to then create a hormetic response. But particularly from an exercise prescription standpoint, if you're applying low magnitude to stress and they feel fine doing it and they feel comfortable, the question you need to ask yourself is, well, am I going to see any changes over time? Or are you going to be in a similar situation where in 3 weeks' time they go, actually, my back still hurts when I'm at work? Because you actually haven't created the changes needed to meet their demands.
And I think that's an important thing with managing exercise prescription in a pathological setting versus a performance setting.
Yes.
Say, for instance, if we use the example of someone who's hurt their back at work doing a manual labor job, the initial period is about trying to get them to pain-free function, right? So that's going to, if the exercise prescription that you have at that level may be at a much lower magnitude, right? And you're trying to induce some of, as you mentioned, these maybe metabolic changes to change the immune and the immunological response that you get, to change the inflammatory status of the person, which potentially changes their symptoms. At that point, you then need to apply mechanical stress to actually improve the function of their tissue to be able to withstand, say, whatever biomechanical task they're doing.
Yes.
And the difference being when you go into a performance setting, they don't have that initial period, and your job is to see whether you can create the mechanical properties in that whole system, but it might be one isolated area to be able to withstand whatever biomechanical task that they're undertaking. And that in itself, I think, gives you an idea of if you're not over time creating that opportunity for them to withstand that biomechanical stressor over, we spoke about stress live curves, over the number of cycles of application that they're going to deal with in their sport or activity, then the stimulus that you're providing is not creating the right properties in that tissue.
Yes. And this comes back to the very reason for training. And if you're working in a rehabilitation setting, it's very useful to always think of where's the end point? Because that gives you an idea of where they are, and you can identify that through testing and where they need to be.
Yeah, there's a paper by Tim Gabber where he talks about the idea of, the floor, the ceiling, and the basement, these kind of concepts. And I think it was helpful for me to see, okay, well, this is where you start. The ceiling is where you would like them to get to, whether it's probably beyond the level of performance that they're currently at or have been to. But it's trying to create the opportunity that when they get to that, they can not only withstand it, but potentially even excel in that activity. And an example would be is if you only ever produce the capability in someone's, say playing tennis, for instance, if you only do 100 serves per day, but in a match you end up doing 200, clearly they're not exposing themselves to the requirement of that activity. And it's not saying they definitely will fail, but there is opportunity for them to fail. So what you're trying to do with your training intervention and your exercise prescription is create the capability to withstand those stresses over time. Yes. And that's what that needs analysis of the task is doing.
Well, I think this also highlights probably the next principle we need to think about, apart from specificity, is progressive overload.
Yep.
Because part of your requirement as a clinician, coach, whatever it may be, is how you apply enough stress over time to continue to see adaptation. Because the reality is, what's the appropriate stress to create adaptation today is going to be different potentially in a week, let alone a month, a year.
And inherently, that's the nature of a biological structure. It's not static.
Yes.
And I know, we spoke about it with Richard.
Yeah.
You don't like the term homeostasis because it suggests that it's static. It's not static. It's dynamic, and it's always dynamic. And I think this is a really important concept. I remember you spoke about this at one stage, and it really got me thinking of, and we speak about it in our discussion on flexibility. If you're not improving something, you're going backwards, right? Because the nature of time is in an aging biological system, particularly once you've gone through, say, pubescence, is that you're going backwards. So unless you're willing to actually create enough stress to change that system, you're probably, your capability is going down.
And that's one of the biggest problems we see within the general population. Like when people present with neck pain, back pain, I mean, of course, we need to identify if there's potential severe pathology that needs addressing, but more often than not, it fits into this very non-specific
and
category.
It's because they've become sedentary.
Absolutely.
And over time, they've actually lost capability.
It's an underuse. It highlights too that when we think about physical capacity and exercise, it's not just about exercising to be able to complete certain tasks or sport, because most people in the general population do physically very little. It's also thinking about all the signals and stimulus it provides to the body outside of maintaining or being able to perform certain physical feats. Similar to what I was talking about before, part of it is about maintaining certain muscle mass, because we know that has a big impact on our hormonal system.
Other areas of your health.
And our immune system, Part of it is about maintaining relatively low fat mass, because again, we know that is metabolically active. So it's interesting. We often talk about specificity or specificity specifically related to the task, which obviously is very relevant. I think in the general population, we need to think about like what should be like the baseline requirements in terms of the amount of muscle mass you need. I mean, there are some guidelines out there in terms of you should do this amount of like low intensity exercise, this amount of high intensity, but I think there's a lot more to be done. Like it's quite interesting when you look at bone. There's actually a lot of research showing what should be your bone mineral density and what predisposes you to say things like osteoporosis or fractures in elderly populations. I think we need to be thinking much more about what are the
and I think
requirements.
That concept was really highlighted to me recently. I had a cyclist come in. He's a bit older, and he said, "I haven't really changed my training, but my performance is going down."
Yeah, and
I said to him, "Well, as you age, you actually need to create greater stimulus in order to even just maintain your level of performance."
Yes,
and this happens, as you said, in bone. You know, the bone tissue over time degrade, particularly as we age, for various reasons, and you actually need to create a stimulus that maintains that. And there are ways of doing it. Obviously, there's lots of research showing resistance training, high impact forces, gram reaction forces will do that. So things like running actually will maintain bone density as you age, which I always find interesting, because one of the things that people often get told is stop running, start doing non-weight bearing activities.
Get in the pool.
Yeah, and the non-weight bearing activities, particularly because they tend to be associated with endurance activity, actually leaches more calcium out of your bones anyway. So you end up losing bone mineral density.
Well, yeah, you're reducing the amount of physical stress you're applying to the tissue. I've got a question for you then, John, talking about this athlete. How much do you think the issue he presents with reductions in his performance has to do with his adaptability changing because he's aging?
Well, I would say some level. He's in his early 70s now, so I think he's starting to get to that age where your adaptive window closes. But interestingly, and he was very open-minded, which it's always good working with people like that, where his idea was, okay, well, what else do I need to do in order to try and maintain? And it was clear that a lot of his mechanical output features, his strength, his power, was reducing. So, our job is to see, can we provide the right stimulus to maintain something. It's very similar to what you're saying with the running example you gave from that presentation, where these runners, and for him, doing more cycling is probably not going to create the changes that you want because he's got such a history of training in that area that the magnitude and even the volume of training he would need to do to actually shift, say, his VO2 max or some of those features, or, volume, mechanics within his heart. One, they're changing anyway because he's getting older, but two, the stimulus would need to be so great that he potentially risks, hurting himself or breaking down or compromising his immune function by training, his endurance training so dramatically. Versus doing a gym session once or twice a week, he may actually see huge improvements or maintenance of previous performance by introducing something that, sometimes the term gets used like low-hanging fruit. He's not particularly strong, and I don't think he's ever done a lot of resistance training. There is room for improvement there.
Yeah, it's actually interesting too, like talking about what is the magnitude of stresses he needs to apply. I think of that, some of the research, that study you talked about or shared with the clinic of metabolic dysfunction associated with elite endurance athletes because they're applying so much metabolic stress from doing just kilometers and kilometers of running that they're potentially causing maladaptations because they're simply the amount that they need to try and improve it is greater than what their body can use to adapt.
And this is a concept that I find super interesting, but it comes to the idea of when you get to the end of, say, your adaptive capability in an area, you get a divergence, and we've spoken about this concept before, but a divergence away from healthy adaptation. And what I mean by that is elite sport and performance at absolute maximum levels of human performance is not a particularly healthy pursuit.
Yes.
Because you're pushing way beyond what would be considered a reasonable and almost normal amount of stress that you're applying.
This actually takes me back. Was this something we talked about years ago?
Yeah.
But because we often associate physical activity with good health, which absolutely is. But for the elite athlete, there's
a divergence.
Absolutely, yeah. I was actually thinking, I think it's always good to give context to these discussions, like talking about a real world situation. So in your role as a track coach, thinking about concepts of particularly maturation and how the training stimulus has changed. Can you give an example of, say, a young sprinter who you may have just started with, who's, say, 18 years old, who has very little resistance training history, obviously got experience on the track, versus, say, someone who's in their mid-20s that's been with you for, say, 5+ years and has developed a good foundation of physical capacities and what they can do within the gym setting?
Yeah, I think the key things that change are that the stimulus magnitude needs to be much higher to create change in the older and more physically mature, particularly within that sporting domain, right? They need much higher stimulus, right? So how you organize your training around allowing them to actually be exposed to that and making sure that you're doing it in a smart way so that they're not going to break down with injury.
Yes.
With the younger person who has less exposure, you're trying to, as you said, you're trying to develop more of those broad base of physical features, some of them being metabolic, some of them being, developing more tissue. So if you get a young sprinter and they typically don't have as much muscle mass as someone who's 5, 6, 7 years older than them. So early on, to do and to create those kind of stimulus, you're usually doing more volume, and you're probably doing it at a lower intensity because that they can't necessarily, both from a neurological level, they can't send the message from the brain to that tissue to be able to create those levels of force or rate of force development
without accumulating lots of fatigue.
Yes, yeah. The risk that you take is they can do it.
What's that issue of the primary response, i.e. the negative response, might be way too prolonged that it affects other training sessions.
Yeah. And then it's about when you say that, it makes me think straight away of the hierarchy of importance of what you do. And this comes back to understanding, as you said, the specific adaptations. So I always say to younger coaches and to people, even if it's in clinical settings or if it's in sports, science and sports performance, to look at the work of, Dr. Anatoly Bondarchuk, and his exercise classification.
Yes.
He's got a pyramid that I think from UK Athletics, Tom Crick, I think there's an image of it which helps, but he talks about the hierarchy of what's going to transfer the most, what actually creates that change, and what's more specific. And at the top, it's obviously going to be your competitive event, and competitive exercise. So they might be replicating, as you mentioned before, with distance run, like time trial.
Yeah.
Then there's
or just competing itself. Yeah.
Yeah. Then there's the specific exercises that may help support that. Then there's the specific exercises that may actually prepare you for that.
Yes.
All those different tasks. And then there's general underlying physical capabilities. And that might be like, abdominal strength and, and lumbar pelvic, strength and stability. It might be, development of, if it's in distance running, like developing calf and ankle complex strength and stability.
Yes.
It might be developing some of those really basic underlying elastic, bouncing and jumping properties. With those athletes, you spend much more time developing and exposing them to those general and special preparatory and special development exercise, menu items before you give. And it's not that you don't allow them to do the competitive exercise; you do,
of course. But the actual amount of time you spend in each domain
is going to be different. Yes. Whereas for an athlete that is much more mature and can actually withstand the magnitude of stress, because the magnitude as you go closer to the competitive event is the magnitude of, and intensity is higher. As you go towards the more general exercise, it's lower.
Yes.
You will spend much more time in those specific domains where you're working on the competitive exercise. So with my sprinters that are older, they're often running very close to maximum in a lot of the sessions that they do. Not all of them, but a lot of the sessions that they do. Whereas I wouldn't necessarily do that with some of the younger athletes, right? And if you do, it's not that you can't. You do it. The volume that they can do will be much less.
Yes.
Right? And you might work at that volume in meters. If it's a sprinter, if it's a distance runner, for instance, it might be in kilometers or whatever it is. But the total volume that they can carry out in one session and across a week is going to be less than that, for that less mature athlete in terms of training history compared to the more mature athlete.
Yes.
And so they're the sort of interplays that and it doesn't mean that the adaptation isn't going to be maximized by doing that more specific and competitive event. It's just that how much can they be exposed to, because they don't have, as you mentioned, that stress tolerance. Yes. They can't do lots and lots of sprint training at very high intensities with very long recoveries, so they're really hitting it hard.
Yes.
They'll get injured. Whereas a top athlete who's done lots and lots and lots of that training can do more.
Yeah, and this is where this concept of maturation is really important. I think that hierarchy of importance is a useful thing too, because I think from if someone presents with an injury, for instance, you've got your needs analysis, which then you can look at, say, the biomechanics of their movement, or you can look at their tissue capacity. So things like flexibility, strength endurance, absolute maximum strength, the power spectrum, the elastic spectrum, and identify what are the key areas that they need for their sport. Is there a deficit? Let's address those deficits. I think it's also interesting too, though, when you've got, say, more mature athlete in terms of their training history. So this example of someone who's in their mid-20s who's been got 5, 7, 10 years training history, of when they actually have if you look at, say, the physical requirements for their sport and you assess them, you go, actually, they're kind of ticking most of the boxes there. Finding that balance between being really specific with their sport versus building up just general capacities over that whole spectrum, that whole pyramid. Because to me, that highlights two things. And it's actually, when I think of it, it's probably related to the article I discussed before, where one, do they have deficits within a particular region, which means that the neuromuscular patterns they create to complete that task don't utilize that region and overcompensates with other areas of the body? Or is there the requirement to develop certain tissue properties when we think about, say, the example of distance running, of, say, building up tendon stiffness, which will then improve their running economy, or building up, say, metabolic capacity so they can recover? That I find is actually a very challenging thing, And I was interested.
That balance is hard. I think that balance is always hard because you're trying to maintain the properties that will. To me, I always think about it as like, if you could run, flat out every day, you're going to get more adaptation than if you couldn't. The problem is that you'll break down.
Well, I'm setting you up a bit here, John, because I'm thinking of the next principle of variability. So how do you, as a coach, because you're going to have much more insight into this than me, how do you maintain the importance of variability for adaptation? Because if you're doing the same thing time and again, you're going to have a window of diminishing returns. How do you maintain enough variability, but obviously don't go to the point where you're getting
mixed messages
or a lack of specificity?
Yeah. I think the way that you do that is by manipulating particularly, the training environment. And that can be done on so many levels. Some of it can be psychological, for instance, by like introducing competitiveness within the actual training setting. Sometimes they might do it individually. Sometimes they'll do it competitively. It might be things like changing surfaces.
We're not telling them the session, I remember you saying?
Yeah, I think sometimes that, from a psychological point of view can be really valuable.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily have them preparing days in advance. And I think although, a lot of athletes do want to know, some don't anyway. So it kind of depends on their personal sort of like mindset around that kind of thing. But I think learning to manipulate those factors is probably what creates enough variability, even if the session itself is not dramatically different or the type of training is not dramatically different. And it's always really interesting, like even something as simple as doing it in an environment where, say the weather's nice, there's, music, the guys have the music playing,
sure.
They're doing it competitively. There's other fast athletes that maybe they compete against at the track at the same time. The level of performance is elevated straight away.
Yeah.
And you haven't really changed any of the training factors themselves.
Yeah.
And your job is to be able to manipulate those and utilize them at different times. Like at the moment, for instance, we're in winter and we're still running fast. But I know that the performance that I get now is not the same as what I get in November or December, even if the session's the same and the level of intent from the athletes the same, just because the weather's not necessarily conducive to high tissue temperatures and all those kind of things. And even level of motivation is different. But in my mind, I don't actually think the adaptation is different. And this is a personal position. I think that if your intent is the same, then you actually still get the adaptation. And the reason I say that is I've prepared people in winter to go and race, say, in a warmer place, and they end up running fast. It hasn't stopped them from running fast, even though at training, when we're in the cold weather, they're not moving anywhere near as quickly as what they do in the race.
Yes.
And this comes back even, as we said, we've mentioned a few times, but the discussion we had with Richard, where we spoke about chronobiology and the effect of training at different times of the day and whether you're maximizing on adaptive windows. I actually tend to slant more towards not trying to do everything in the perfect outcome. And I don't know whether that's a personal psychological kind of position, because I tend to slant towards allowing people to be slightly uncomfortable with the, exposure that they're having, both psychologically and physiologically. And that's for multiple reasons, which I won't get into now. But I think it's important that we try and put people in situations where the adaptation is going to be maximized. And I think that doesn't necessarily happen by everything being perfect. And I think when you start to go down this concept of being overly specific, you sometimes end up trying to make everything perfect.
And the issue then too, I know we've talked about this before, but if you over-constrain the circumstances where you're like, oh, yep, everything's controlled here, it's perfect, okay, that can be useful. And like I think of, say, a gym setting, that can be useful because you can focus on building up certain capacities. But then if we want to get that transfer to the real world, to performance, well, you got to realize that it's an open environment and there is so many variables.
We speak about it in terms of performance, but I think it's very, very relevant for occupational settings, for injuries. How often is it that you do a so-called perfect rehabilitation with someone, which is in a controlled setting like this?
Yes.
Then they step out onto the field or they go back to work and they come back and say, oh, I'm sore again.
Yeah.
And that comes down to maybe you haven't applied enough stimulus. But often it's because the movement variability that they are exposed to in that biomechanical task is not controlled. You cannot, if you're lifting something, say we work with removalists, if they're trying to manipulate a couch down a really awkward stairwell, it's not the same as even if we asked them to walk up and down here carrying a heavy weight that's heavier than what they would be carrying with the couch.
Yeah.
Or the partner that they're lifting with, all of a sudden, jolts on a step because they lose their balance slightly and they put their foot down and then the person has to sort of like go forward. That level of perturbation is not going to necessarily expose them if we think about applying the very specific stimulus. And it comes back to that idea of the only really specific stimulus is the task itself.
Absolutely. Yeah, because you've got environmental task and the organism specific elements that are required. How do you go about then, what's your thinking when you think about building up specific capacities, say in a controlled environment like this, to its application in their particular task or sport?
Well, I think it's about slowly exposing them to that task. I think one of the things that often works well if it's in an occupational setting is, they talk about light duties. If there's a nice process with that where it's like they can do half a day rather than the whole day, or they can do alternate days with their work, so they've got a recovery period in between. That works well. The same with sport. We spoke about it with Brady. It doesn't always work in the AFL, but it works well if the guys come through the VFL system because they can play half a game, or two-thirds or whatever it is, and they can really control the minutes of exposure.
Yes.
So I think that's a better way of doing it because you need to expose them to more specific stuff, but they're not ready for the maximum volume of that. Yeah,
the good thing about this environment is we can control a lot more factors, so then we know how much actual physical stress are being.
Yeah, so once you feel like you've got enough exposure in a very controlled setting, you need to slowly expose them to a less controlled setting.
Yes,
and then slowly increase the volume of that exposure to that uncontrolled stress environment to a point where they're now able to deal with that consistently, so that they're not having injury or performance decrements at that level.
Yeah, and it gives the person an opportunity to, if they build up specific capacities in a gym setting where they've built up improvements in strength in a region or multiple regions, improve flexibility, we need to think about, well, how do you actually transfer that into the competitive setting or in their work environment? Well, the way you do that is actually being in that environment.
Yeah, of course.
We need to think about, and generally there's going to be steps from that point to that point, but if you, in order to actually realize the effects of that training stimulus, you need to make sure that they can utilize it within their particular sport or
and it's exactly what we spoke about. If we circle all the way back to the start, it's exposure. It's the hormetic process. You slowly expose them to that toxin. If that toxin's their occupational setting, or if it's a sporting environment, you slowly expose them to more and more volume of it. And over time, I think this is the most important factor: is that in all appreciable areas, there's probably no evidence to suggest that the capacity for adaptation ever ends in human beings, right? And I think that that's really important for people to understand, that people can withstand any exposures to stress if you've progressively worked your way towards it.
Well, actually this highlights too, made me think of, is the concept of hormesis isn't just limited to mechanical stress.
No.
Like your psychological or emotional state.
And everyone knows it. Like,
yes.
I know I'm jumping in, but everyone knows it. It's like when you first start work, in full-time work, you're very tired, you're very stressed, emotionally you're drawn. You get 6 months down the track and it's easy for you to work your 40-hour week and not feel tired emotionally, like fatigued in any way. You just, that's a normal week for me. When you first start, you feel really overwhelmed and really stressed and you're anxious and you don't know what to do. That's that adaptation. That's a psychological adaptation and an emotional adaptation that you have from the exposure of work stress.
And we know that that's really important too from a physical factor too, because psychological stress is going to alter your sensory motor control, like the neuromuscular patterns you create. Like that's obvious when you think about, like, I'm nervous, I feel a bit stiff, I feel a bit rigid. That's going to affect your movement patterns. That's going to affect how you articulate yourself. So we also need to really appreciate that the concept of hormesis, and when we think about how we put all this together, it's not just about what you do in the gym. We need to make sure that we prepare that person in terms of the specific environment, in addition to the specific task, in addition to developing the physical capacities we think that individual needs to be able to do that.
I think you summed it up well.
Well, actually, I thought we should just finish on one other thing. Well, where are we going with time?
An hour and 5.
The last thing I was thinking about was individuality.
Yeah.
Now, it's funny because, like, this, I think, to me, is probably the most obvious one, and perhaps pretty simple when you think about it, but I think it often gets overlooked. But when you think about individuality, what do you think of, and why is it important?
It's important because obviously everyone is different, and we know that those traits are developed from exposure to previous stresses and the underlying, position they start from. So whether that's a genetic, predisposition, and those exposures to stresses are going down that epigenetic kind of discussion.
Yes. And then we think about, like, some of the concepts we've talked about in terms of their adaptability and their maturation.
Yeah. And so you do need to put those in context. The thing that you're always trying to balance is that the task often doesn't have the same level of individualization that you could potentially use for that individual within the exposure to stress. So, for example, if you've got someone who is participating in a team sport versus an individual sport, you probably have a lot more scope for how you apply stresses to the individual sport than you do for the team sport, because the requirements are different in terms of what the outcome needs to be for that individual within that setting. One needs to be able to contribute to the team. The other one is just contributing to their own performance.
Yes. I think one of the issues I think that influences our thinking is individuality also is based on the individual response, because the reality is, if you and I did the same training program, we're going to get different adaptations. And maybe we get similar, but even the actual timeline for adaptation changes. And this is, I think, can be problematic when we look at research, because what is research actually providing you? It's providing you an average of a cohort.
Yeah.
So it gives you a signal that on average, we see this response when we look at.
But it's always funny though, because if you actually ever see the individual data,
or look at the range,
the ranges are huge, and you think, well, some people got way worse from this intervention, some people got way better, and then it landed somewhere in the middle, and that average performance was, statistically it was significantly positive.
Yeah.
But what about those 50 people that had a terrible outcome from that intervention?
Yeah,
you can't apply that to what you do for them.
And I think we do ourselves a disservice when you have one patient comes in with a particular injury, you follow a particular rehab protocol or rehab program, they get better. Another patient comes in with the same injury and you don't see the same response. And the issue, I think, then is, well, one, don't always throw the baby out with the bathwater. Perhaps the issue is that they do need that kind of intervention, resistance training or manual therapy, whatever it may be, but their starting point is very different. And that may be that you have to do a lot less or potentially a lot more. I
think, like we often have spoken about David Snowden, and I like that he uses, mapping sometimes as, a visualization of how where you want to end up.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that he presents that to me is really interesting is you might have a cluster of individuals down in this bottom. So if it's a square and they're clustered in this corner, and you know that you want them to get up to this corner.
Yes.
And the way in which you get them there could be very different. They still need to get to that corner. One person might go this way, then that way. Another person might go straight there. Another one might go the other direction and then up. You all end up at the same destination. The individualization aspect for us is to work out which path does that individual need to go to get to that point. And that's where I think the fun, experimental, artistic side of what we do is possible, as long as you use those principles that we've been speaking about, so that you can have someone arrive at a similar position. Like for me, if it's in my sport, the qualifying times are the same for every individual for a certain event.
Yes.
How you get that person to that qualifying time or that qualification may be really different. You might choose different races. You might choose very different training protocols. They might run the race very differently, but they've got to end up at the same spot.
Yes. And
that's what I think it's about. It's about working out for that individual with what they have and what that they need to develop. How do they end up at that destination?
And that's where data is useful. I mean, there's the issue of too much data, but at the same time too, if you're not utilizing the data that you collect to influence what you're doing.
Yeah, and inform you.
Yeah. The basic example is if someone keeps having, we've got an example of this as a patient, but recurrent hamstring strains, and you assess their hamstring strength and it's fantastic. The reality of trying to improve their hamstring strength being the cure is very unlikely.
Yeah. And we've seen, as I said, with an individual that we've been dealing with recently, where they turned up and their hamstring strength was much higher than what the values of healthy range was suggested to be
for his population.
For his population, in an athletic population, he was way above what was expected. So it's not strength that's limiting him. And that's an interesting concept. It's like, how do you approach this problem? He's still got to get to this destination to be able to carry out his event and what he's doing and withstand the volume of that task.
And that comes down to the very simple principle I always use is when you start to apply an intervention, what's their trajectory? Are they heading in, like you were describing before, to the point where you want them to be? Because, if they're not, okay, something has to change. But at the same time too, that's where I think it's important to keep an open mind at times when you think, well, what do I need to do here? The data's saying that I need to do this. It's not what I would typically do, but maybe it is, but sometimes it isn't. But actually following what the presenting condition or that person's presentation actually tells you. Yeah,
and I think that all comes down to that process that we've spoken about within this discussion of understanding where you need to end up, and move towards that by applying principles that, are relevant to that individual.
Yeah.
All right, I think...
Finish it there, John?
That might finish it. Thank you for joining us, guys.